The restaurant was busy that afternoon. People were talking softly, plates were clinking, and the smell of fresh food filled the air. The lights were warm, and the staff moved quickly, serving guests with practiced ease. Among the diners, there was a man who stood out not because of what he wore but because of the way he carried himself. He had a presence that made people notice him even before he spoke. He was well-dressed, calm and confident, but today something in his eyes showed impatience and frustration. The waitress working the floor was young. She had started her shift earlier and had been running from table to table, trying to keep up with the steady stream of customers. She liked her job, but it was stressful, especially during the lunch rush. Today was no different, and she was aware that a special guest was arriving soon. She had been told about him, the billionaire who was known for being demanding. She had heard stories from coworkers about how he could make a simple mistake feel like the end of the world. She tried to calm herself and focus on doing her job well. Meanwhile, the billionaire walked in through the main doors, accompanied by a small assistant carrying his briefcase. His eyes scanned the room quickly, noting the arrangement of tables, the staff, and the diners. He walked with a purpose, each step precise and confident. His assistant followed silently, carrying notes and ensuring everything went smoothly. The atmosphere shifted slightly as he moved through the restaurant. Staff straightened, and some diners turned their heads to watch him. The young waitress was nearby when she heard about his arrival. She glanced at the clock and realized she had a few minutes to get to his table. She hurried, weaving through the tables carefully, balancing her tray in her hands. Her heart beat faster as she approached the table where he was waiting. She wanted to make a good impression, to show that she could handle the pressure. But the timing did not go as planned. A sudden delay in the kitchen had held up her orders, and she had been caught in a corner carrying plates for another table. By the time she reached the billionaire's table, she was a little out of breath. He looked up from his phone, and his eyes immediately met hers. There was an intensity in his gaze that made her stomach tighten. She gave him a small, nervous smile and tried to speak, but he interrupted. "You're late," he said, his voice loud enough to draw attention from nearby tables. The words were sharp, and there was no mistaking the anger behind them. The waitress felt her face flush. She had not meant to be late, and she wanted to apologize, but his tone made it difficult to find the right words. "I'm very sorry," she said quickly. "There was a delay in the kitchen. I didn't mean to keep you waiting." He sighed and leaned back slightly, shaking his head. His assistant stepped forward, speaking quietly into his ear, but the billionaire waved him off. He was focused entirely on the young waitress. She stood there, holding the tray tightly, trying not to tremble. She felt the eyes of other diners on her and wished she could disappear. The billionaire's voice softened slightly but still carried authority. "I understand things happen, but punctuality is important, especially when you're serving someone who has a lot of things to manage." She nodded, swallowing her nerves. "Yes, sir. I understand. It won't happen again." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. There was something in the way he looked at her, as if he were assessing more than just her performance. He was used to controlling situations, making decisions quickly, and getting results. But there was also a hint of curiosity in his eyes, something that made her pause. She placed the water glasses on the table carefully, her hands slightly shaking. He noticed and frowned, but not angrily. It was the tension of the moment that seemed to interest him more than her mistake. He watched as she moved to hand him the menu, her movements careful and precise. She spoke softly, explaining the specials of the day, her voice trembling just slightly. "Thank you," he said, his tone neutral but firm. He glanced around the room, then back at her. "You seem nervous. Are you new here?" She shook her head quickly. "No, sir. I've been working here for a while. I didn't expect to be serving you today." He raised an eyebrow, a faint smile appearing for the first time. "I see. Well, I hope today goes smoothly for both of us." For a moment there was silence. The sounds of the restaurant returned to normal, and she felt a small sense of relief. She had survived the initial confrontation, but she knew the tension was not entirely gone. She placed the tray down and stepped back, ready to take his order. As she wrote down his choices, she noticed him glance around the restaurant again. There was a calm authority in his movements, a way of observing everything without seeming to pay attention. He was clearly used to being in control, making sure things went his way. She felt a mix of fear and admiration. There was something magnetic about the way he carried himself, even when angry. He placed his order carefully, specifying exactly how he wanted each item prepared. She nodded and repeated it back to ensure she had it right. As she moved toward the kitchen, she could feel his gaze following her. It made her heart race, not with fear this time, but with a strange sense of awareness that she was being noticed. In the kitchen, she explained the details of his order to the chefs, making sure nothing was left out. The pressure was high, but she kept her focus, knowing that any mistake now could escalate the situation again. She felt a mix of anxiety and determination. She wanted to prove herself not just for the billionaire, but for her own confidence. When she returned to the table with the drinks, he looked up again. This time, his expression was slightly softer, less sharp. He took a sip, then set the glass down carefully. He studied her briefly, then nodded. Better. That's how I like it. She felt a small wave of relief wash over her. The encounter had been intense, but she managed to handle it. She smiled politely, though still a little nervously, and asked if he needed anything else while he looked at the menu. As she moved away to give him a moment of privacy, she noticed a small, delicate necklace around her own neck. It was a simple chain with a tiny pendant, something she always wore for good luck. She didn't notice at first, but when she returned to take his order, she realized the billionaire was staring, his eyes locking onto the pendant in a way that made her pause. For a brief moment, she felt a strange unease. She had no idea why he was looking so intently at something so small. She adjusted the necklace slightly, hoping it would go unnoticed, but the attention lingered. The initial confrontation had passed, but a new sense of curiosity had taken its place. She wondered what he was thinking, and why something so simple seemed to catch his eye so strongly. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, studying her movements. The tension of the moment had shifted from anger to something else, something subtle but powerful. He seemed to be observing not just her service but something deeper, something personal. She felt a mix of fear and intrigue, unsure what would come next. As she continued to serve him throughout the meal, she noticed his occasional glances toward the necklace. There was no anger, no judgment, just a deep, focused interest. She tried to concentrate on her work, keeping her movements calm and precise, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something important was about to happen. The rest of the lunch progressed with careful attention from both sides. The billionaire ate quietly, occasionally giving brief instructions or comments about the food. She moved efficiently, responding to his needs without drawing too much attention. Each time their eyes met, there was a silent exchange, a tension that was different from the earlier confrontation. It was less about anger and more about awareness, curiosity, and an unspoken connection. By the time the meal was nearing its end, the initial fear she had felt had shifted into a cautious confidence. She had managed to handle the situation, to serve a difficult customer with grace under pressure. But she also realized that this encounter was unlike any she had experienced before. There was a sense of significance in his attention, a feeling that this moment was more than just another lunch service. The billionaire finished his meal and leaned back, signaling that he was satisfied. She cleared the table with careful movements, her mind still aware of the necklace around her neck and the strange attention it had drawn. He seemed lost in thought for a moment, then looked up and spoke in a calm but firm tone. "You did well today." Her heart lifted slightly at the compliment, a rare acknowledgement from someone so demanding. She smiled politely, nodding her thanks. The initial confrontation had been tense and frightening, but now it felt like the beginning of something unexpected, something that went beyond the usual interactions of a busy restaurant. As she stepped away to prepare the check, she couldn't help but glance back. The billionaire was still observing her, not with anger this time, but with a quiet intensity that made her wonder what he was thinking. The first part of the story had ended, But it was clear that this encounter was only the beginning of something more. Something that neither of them could have anticipated. Something that would change the tone of their interaction in ways that neither could yet understand. As the waitress returned to the table to refill the water glasses, she noticed the billionaire staring in a way that made her uneasy. At first, she thought he was simply observing her work, but there was something more to it. A quiet intensity that seemed to pierce through her carefully maintained composure. She straightened her back and smiled politely, but her hands trembled slightly as she set down the glasses. He leaned back in his chair and regarded her silently, his eyes not leaving hers. She felt the heat rise to her cheeks, unsure if it was embarrassment from earlier or curiosity about his sudden change in demeanor. There was no anger in his eyes now, only focus. For a moment, she wondered if she had done something wrong again, but she couldn't place what it might be. Then her gaze dropped briefly, and she caught sight of the necklace around her neck. It was a delicate piece, simple in design, a small pendant that had been in her family for years. She had never considered it anything special, just a keepsake that reminded her of home and her parents. But now, she noticed his stare fixated on it. The realization made her pause. Why would he be looking at such a small piece of jewelry? The billionaire finally spoke, his voice quieter than before but firm, commanding attention nonetheless. "That necklace," he said, pointing subtly with a finger. "Where did you get it?" She hesitated, unsure how much to say. She had been asked questions before about her jewelry, but never with such intensity. "It belonged to my family," she said carefully. "It's been passed down. I don't know where it originally came from." He nodded slowly, as if the explanation didn't satisfy him entirely but was enough for the moment. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "It looks familiar," he said. His voice was softer now, less sharp than before. There was curiosity there, mingled with something else she couldn't name. She tried to hide the rising anxiety, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. The restaurant around them seemed to fade slightly in her awareness. For a moment, it was just the two of them in a quiet bubble, her heart pounding as she realized this was not just a casual glance. There was something about the necklace that had caught his attention in a way that felt personal, almost emotional. She swallowed hard, not knowing how to respond. "It's very delicate," he continued, studying it closely. "I haven't seen one like it in years. It belongs to someone very dear to me." His words were calm, but there was an unmistakable weight behind them. She looked at him, puzzled, but kept her expression neutral, careful not to reveal too much. He leaned back again, his fingers tapping lightly on the table as he seemed lost in thought. The brief flash of anger from earlier had completely vanished, replaced by a quiet intensity that made her uneasy. She continued to take care of his needs, refilling water, adjusting his napkin, keeping the moment professional while her mind raced. The billionaire studied her movements carefully, as if trying to understand more than just her service. There was a depth to his gaze now, a curiosity that bordered on concern. He seemed to be tracing back memories, connecting something from his past with the present. She noticed that his voice was calm, almost soft, when he spoke again. "I think I might know where this came from. Are you sure you've had it for a long time?" She nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. It's been with my family for years. We never really knew much about it." He leaned forward, resting his chin lightly on his hand. "It's strange," he said almost to himself. "This looks exactly like something my daughter had. She lost it months ago. I've been trying to find it ever since." The waitress froze, her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't expected this. Her hands, holding a small notepad, tightened slightly. She glanced down at the necklace, suddenly seeing it in a new light. Could it really be the same one? The billionaire's calm tone belied the seriousness of his words. He seemed almost relieved to see it, yet there was a weight of emotion behind his eyes that she could not ignore. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's always been in my family. I never thought it belonged to anyone else." He nodded slowly, a small, almost imperceptible smile forming. "It's okay," he said. I'm glad to see it again. I've been looking everywhere. This is unexpected. His eyes softened, and the sharpness from earlier had completely disappeared. He seemed caught between relief and curiosity, unsure whether to react with joy or caution. The waitress felt a strange connection forming in that moment. She had served him as part of her job, yet now there was something personal, something that transcended the typical boundaries of service and customer. She realized that this was no longer just a lunch. This was a meeting of chance, a moment where lives intersected in an unexpected way. He continued to speak, his voice low and reflective. I never expected to see this again. I thought it was lost forever. It's strange how life works sometimes. One moment you're frustrated about being late, and the next you're reminded of something important from the past. She nodded, unsure what to say. She could feel the tension from earlier fading, replaced by a quiet curiosity and shared understanding. For the first time, she felt that she was not just serving a customer but participating in something meaningful, something beyond the ordinary. The conversation shifted slightly as he asked about her family, trying to understand how the necklace had ended up with her. She explained as much as she could without revealing too much, recounting the small details of how her parents had received it and how it had been passed down. He listened intently, nodding occasionally, piecing together the story in his mind. There was a strange calm in the air now. The initial anger had melted into curiosity, and curiosity had grown into a quiet connection. She felt a mix of relief and wonder, realizing that a simple piece of jewelry had changed the entire tone of their interaction. He was no longer the intimidating figure from before, but a man touched by a memory, seeking understanding. As she moved to refill his water again, he asked gently, "Do you know what it means to me?" His voice was soft, almost hesitant. She shook her head, curious. He continued, explaining in simple words that it was a gift for his daughter, something that held deep personal value. She listened, her heart sympathetic and intrigued by the story. The narrative seemed to build a bridge between them. She had started the day nervous, unsure of how to handle a demanding customer. And now she was part of a story that seemed larger than herself. The room around them continued its rhythm, the clatter of dishes and soft conversations continuing. But for a moment, it felt as though the world had paused just for their exchange. The billionaire paused, studying her expression carefully. "I don't know how it ended up with your family," he said softly. "But I am glad it is in safe hands. It has traveled a long way, and maybe it was meant to find you." She felt a warm feeling of relief and connection. There was no judgment, no anger, just a shared sense of something meaningful. She realized that this encounter, which began with tension and frustration, had evolved into a moment of understanding and empathy. She smiled gently, meeting his gaze, feeling a quiet bond form through the simple acknowledgement of the necklace. The rest of the meal continued with a different tone. The billionaire no longer seemed hurried or impatient. He spoke calmly, sometimes asking small questions, sometimes simply observing. She responded efficiently but with a sense of engagement, aware that this moment was unusual and important. There was a sense of human connection, of shared history, even if she did not fully understand it yet. By the time he finished his meal, the atmosphere had completely shifted. The earlier confrontation felt like a distant memory. The focus had moved from frustration to curiosity, from anger to understanding. She realized that a single object, a simple necklace, had created a bridge between two people who had started the day as strangers on opposite sides of a social divide. As she cleared the table and prepared the check, she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment and wonder. The encounter had started with tension and fear but had evolved into a meaningful interaction. The billionaire looked at her once more, a subtle smile playing on his lips, acknowledging her presence and the unusual connection they had shared. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine the story behind the necklace, the journey it had taken, and the people it had touched along the way. She realized that life had a way of surprising people, creating moments that were unexpected and significant. This lunch had been one such moment, a story that would remain with her long after she left the restaurant. As she walked away to handle other tables, she glanced back one last time. He was watching her, not with the sharpness from before, but with quiet attention and a sense of reflection. The second part of the story had unfolded, transforming a moment of tension into one of connection and intrigue. She knew that the necklace had become more than just an accessory. It had become a symbol of something larger, a link between past and present, between strangers who had discovered a shared thread in the most unexpected way. After noticing the necklace, the billionaire leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The connection to his daughter was unmistakable, yet he needed more proof. He studied the young waitress carefully, trying to understand how this delicate piece of jewelry had ended up around the neck of a stranger. There was curiosity, surprise, and a hint of something else, a feeling he had not expected, mixed in his thoughts. The waitress continued her work, refilling water glasses, taking orders from nearby tables, and managing her small team with quiet efficiency. Yet she felt his gaze on her constantly. It was different from before, no longer sharp and demanding, but insistent in a way that made her heart pound. She tried to focus on her job, but the awareness of the necklace and his interest made her movements slightly more deliberate. She was aware of every step, every gesture, every smile. She did not want to make another mistake, yet there was a strange curiosity about him she could not ignore. "Are you sure you've had it for a long time?" he asked gently, his voice quieter than before but still firm enough to command attention. He gestured subtly toward the pendant. The question was simple, but it carried weight, and she understood immediately that this was not just a casual inquiry. It was about uncovering a story, a piece of someone else's life that had unexpectedly crossed her own. She nodded quickly, a mix of nerves and caution. "Yes, sir. My parents gave it to me, and it's been in our family for as long as I can remember. I didn't know it belonged to anyone else." The billionaire leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his eyes never leaving hers. There was an intensity in his gaze that made her swallow hard. "It belonged to my daughter," he said softly. "She lost it months ago, and I've been trying to find it ever since. I never expected to see it here." The waitress froze, feeling a shiver run down her spine. She had always treasured the necklace, never imagining that it could have belonged to someone else, let alone a billionaire's daughter. She adjusted the chain slightly around her neck, trying to keep her composure. "I had no idea," she said quietly. "I promise I would have returned it if I knew." He shook his head slowly, a small, almost imperceptible smile forming. "It's not your fault. You've only cared for it as a family treasure, and that's all that matters. I just never imagined it would find its way to someone like you." She felt a mixture of relief and curiosity. The tension from earlier had melted, replaced by something more profound, an unspoken understanding. She had served him as part of her job, but now the interaction had become personal, meaningful, and slightly surreal. She wanted to ask questions, to understand how it had ended up with her family, but she was unsure if it was appropriate. He seemed to sense her hesitation and continued, his voice calm and reflective. "Sometimes, things are lost, only to find a new home where they are cared for. This necklace, it has traveled a long way, and perhaps it was meant to find you." She nodded, thinking of her parents, the way they had cherished the necklace, and the memories it carried. She realized that this simple object had connected her to someone else's story in a way she had never imagined. It was more than jewelry. It was a link between past and present, between people who had never met. The billionaire continued to ask gentle questions, wanting to understand more about her family and how the necklace had been passed down. She explained as much as she could, recounting small details of its journey from her parents to her. He listened intently, nodding occasionally, piecing together the story in his mind. There was a quiet intensity in his focus, a deep respect for the young woman's honesty and care. As she spoke, she noticed a change in him. The sharpness from earlier was gone, replaced by a quiet warmth and reflection. She realized that he was not just a demanding customer, but a father, a man who cared deeply about something precious. It was a side of him she had not expected to see, and it softened her perception of the intimidating figure she had faced earlier. The conversation shifted slightly as he asked about the necklace's design, its details, and any markings that might confirm its origin. She described the delicate pendant, the small engravings on its back, and the way it had been worn over the years. He listened carefully, nodding with recognition, his eyes reflecting memories of his daughter. "It matches perfectly," he said softly, a mix of relief and emotion in his voice. "I can't believe it ended up here. This is incredible." She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of connection she had not anticipated. The tension, fear, and nervousness of earlier had transformed into curiosity, empathy, and a shared sense of wonder. She realized that this encounter, which had started with frustration and anger, had evolved into something meaningful and unforgettable. He paused for a moment, as if considering his next words carefully. "I want to make sure it gets back to her," he said. "But I also want to thank you. You've cared for it all this time without knowing its history. That means a lot." The waitress smiled politely, feeling a mix of pride and humility. "I'm glad it was safe," she said softly. "I never imagined it had such importance." He nodded, leaning back slightly and studying her with a thoughtful expression. There was a depth to his gaze, a recognition of her character, her honesty, and the care she had shown. She felt a quiet sense of respect growing between them, a mutual understanding that transcended the usual boundaries of customer and server. The restaurant continued its rhythm around them, but in that moment, the world seemed to narrow to the small table, the necklace, and the conversation. Time felt slower, and every word, glance, and gesture carried significance. The young waitress realized that this lunch had become more than a job. It had become a moment of shared humanity, of connection and recognition. The billionaire continued, sharing a few memories of his daughter and the importance of the necklace. She listened, absorbing each detail, imagining the bond between father and child, and feeling a sense of privilege that she could be part of this story, even in a small way. The initial tension and fear from before had transformed completely into curiosity, empathy, and engagement. As the conversation unfolded, the waitress found herself asking questions too, wanting to understand more about the history, the journey, and the significance of the piece. The billionaire responded openly, appreciating her genuine interest and careful attention. There was a sense of trust building, a bridge forming between two people who had started the day as strangers and found themselves connected by fate. By the time the meal was nearly over, the initial confrontation felt like a distant memory. The focus had shifted from frustration to discovery, from anger to understanding, and from separation to connection. She realized that a single object, a small necklace, had transformed the entire interaction, creating a story that was both personal and universal. The billionaire leaned back, a quiet smile forming on his lips. "Thank you for sharing this with me," he said. "It's not just about the necklace. It's about the care, the attention, and the respect you've shown. That means more than you know." The waitress felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of accomplishment and relief. She had navigated the tension, faced the intimidating presence, and now found herself part of something meaningful. She smiled politely, nodding in acknowledgement. "I'm glad it could help," she said softly. As she cleared the table and prepared the check, she felt a quiet sense of wonder. The necklace had become more than a family heirloom. It had become a symbol of connection, trust, and human understanding. The billionaire's presence, initially intimidating and demanding, had shifted to something profoundly human, revealing vulnerability, care, and reflection. The third part of the story had unfolded, transforming fear into empathy, tension into understanding, and strangers into people connected by chance and circumstance. The young waitress realized that life had a way of surprising people, creating moments that were unexpected, meaningful, and lasting. This encounter, which began with frustration and anger, had grown into a story of shared humanity, one that would remain with her long after the lunch ended. After the meal, the billionaire left the restaurant with his assistant quietly trailing behind. The young waitress went back to her duties, her mind still buzzing with what had just happened. She had never imagined a simple piece of jewelry could turn a tense encounter into something so meaningful. As she cleaned tables and refilled drinks for other guests, she found herself glancing at the empty table, thinking about the strange connection she had shared with him. Meanwhile, the billionaire was deep in thought. He couldn't stop thinking about the necklace and how it had ended up with someone else. He knew that his daughter would be relieved and overjoyed to see it again, but there was a question in his mind that needed answering. How had this necklace traveled so far without him noticing? He needed to trace the steps, but he also wanted to understand the young woman who now held a piece of his family's history. Later that day, back in his office, he asked his assistant to run a background check. Not in an intrusive way, but enough to understand the chain of events that might have led to the necklace being in her possession. He wanted to be sure that no mistake had been made, that this was truly the same necklace, and that it had been cared for properly. His assistant carefully noted the details, tracking down the family and any records of second-hand jewelry shops that might have been involved. The young waitress, unaware of the investigation, went about her evening. She spoke with her coworkers, quietly sharing a few details about the unusual lunch, but leaving out the personal story of the necklace. She didn't want to seem boastful or draw attention. She reflected on the way the billionaire had softened, how the anger from earlier had completely vanished, replaced by a curiosity and kindness she hadn't expected. It made her feel small yet significant, part of something larger than herself. A few days later, the billionaire returned to the restaurant. This time, there was no tension in his presence. He smiled as he entered, nodding politely to the staff. The waitress felt a nervous excitement, unsure what this visit might bring. She approached the table with the same careful steps, but this time her heart was steadier, and her hands no longer trembled. He gestured for her to sit briefly, which surprised her, but she complied. The air between them was calm, filled with a shared sense of curiosity and understanding. He explained that his assistant had traced the journey of the necklace and found a clear path from his family to hers. It had been sold through a second-hand shop, passed along to someone else, and eventually ended up in her family's possession without anyone knowing its real origin. She listened intently, fascinated by the story. The necklace that had been so familiar to her was suddenly part of a much larger tale. She had always worn it as a simple keepsake, but now she realized it had a history that connected her to someone else's family in a profound way. It wasn't just jewelry anymore. It was a link between her and a man she barely knew, and through him, a connection to his daughter. He explained gently that his daughter had been heartbroken when the necklace was lost. It wasn't just a material object. It held memories, love, and a sense of family. Seeing it again, even in the hands of a stranger, was a moment of relief and joy for him. She nodded, understanding the weight of what he was saying. She could feel the emotion behind his words, the care and concern that had always been part of his personality, but had been hidden behind the image of a demanding businessman. The billionaire asked her about the care she had given the necklace over the years. She explained that it had been part of her family tradition, cherished and protected, never thinking it belonged to anyone else. He smiled, clearly appreciative. "You have taken care of it as it should be," he said softly. "That is what matters most." They spoke for a long time, tracing the steps of the necklace's journey. Every detail fascinated her. The shops it had passed through, the people who had handled it, and the twists of fate that had brought it into her hands. He spoke with a gentle patience, explaining the chain of events without making her feel guilty or responsible. She felt a growing respect for him, not just as a wealthy man but as a father and someone who valued honesty and care. As they talked, a bond began to form. It was subtle at first, a quiet understanding between two people who had started as strangers but were now connected by history, objects, and empathy. She realized that this was not just about the necklace. It was about trust, connection, and human understanding. The way he listened, the way he spoke, and the way he respected her perspective made her feel valued in a way that few people had ever done. By the end of the conversation, the mystery of the necklace was resolved. He had the information he needed to reunite it with his daughter, and she had the satisfaction of knowing she had been part of preserving something important. The tension from the first encounter had completely disappeared, replaced by a quiet joy and mutual respect. They both understood the significance of the moment, not just as a meeting of chance but as a meaningful chapter in both of their lives. As he left the restaurant that day, he thanked her personally, leaving a generous tip and a note expressing his gratitude. She felt a warm pride, realizing that her actions had mattered in a real, tangible way. It was a reminder that even small deeds, done with care and honesty, could create ripples that touched lives in unexpected ways. The young waitress returned to her work with a renewed sense of purpose. She moved with confidence, aware that she had experienced something extraordinary. The necklace, once a simple family keepsake, had become a symbol of connection and kindness, linking her story to another family in a meaningful way. Later, when the billionaire reunited the necklace with his daughter, he shared the story of the young waitress who had cared for it so diligently. His daughter was overjoyed, not just to have her necklace back, but to know that someone had treated it with such love and respect. It became a story that they would tell for years, a reminder of the kindness of strangers and the unexpected ways life could bring people together. For the young waitress, the experience left a lasting impression. She continued her work with renewed enthusiasm, but she also carried a quiet understanding that sometimes the most ordinary moments could lead to extraordinary connections. The fourth part of the story showed that care, honesty, and attention to detail could create bridges between people, even across social divides and unexpected circumstances. It was a lesson in empathy, patience, and the unexpected ways life could reveal meaningful connections, leaving both the billionaire and the waitress changed in subtle but profound ways. The morning sun shone gently through the windows of the young waitress's apartment as she began her day. The events from the previous week still lingered in her mind. The encounter with the billionaire had started with tension and anger, but had transformed into a story she would never forget. She thought about the necklace, the curiosity in his eyes, and the way their conversation had evolved from frustration to understanding. It was a moment that had made her feel seen, respected, and connected to someone far removed from her own daily life. As she prepared for her shift at the restaurant, she noticed the necklace around her neck. It had always been a part of her, but now it felt heavier with meaning. She touched the pendant lightly, thinking about the journey it had taken and the families it had connected. Life, she realized, had a way of surprising people, creating moments that were small but carried deep significance. When she arrived at work, she was greeted by the familiar hum of activity. Orders were being taken, plates clattered in the kitchen, and the soft chatter of diners filled the air. She moved efficiently, greeting guests and checking on their needs. Yet her thoughts kept returning to the billionaire and the story of the necklace. She wondered how it would feel for his daughter to see it again, to have a piece of her family's history restored after it had been missing for so long. Later that afternoon, the billionaire returned to the restaurant. This visit was different from the first. There was no tension, no impatience in his steps. He smiled as he entered, nodding politely to the staff. The young waitress felt a flutter of nervous excitement but also a sense of calm. She knew that whatever happened today would not be like the first encounter. There was a mutual understanding now, built on shared experience and empathy. He approached her table, greeting her warmly. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice calm and friendly. "I wanted to thank you again for everything." She smiled politely, feeling a quiet pride. "Good afternoon, sir. I'm glad I could help." He gestured for her to sit briefly, and she complied. The atmosphere was calm, filled with a sense of human connection. He began to recount how he had reunited the necklace with his daughter. She listened, her heart lifting as he described the joy and relief on his daughter's face. When she saw the piece of jewelry she thought she had lost forever. It was more than an object to them. It was a symbol of love, memory, and family. As he spoke, she felt a quiet satisfaction. She had been part of a chain of events that led to happiness, without even realizing it. It was a reminder that ordinary actions, small gestures, and care for the things entrusted to her could have a profound impact on others. She realized that the encounter had changed her perspective, teaching her the importance of honesty, diligence, and empathy in every aspect of life. He paused, studying her with a thoughtful expression. "You treated it with care," he said softly. "You didn't know its history, but you preserved it. That means more than I can express." Her chest warmed at his words. "Thank you, sir. I just wanted to do what was right." There was a moment of silence as they both reflected on the journey of the necklace. It had traveled through different hands, been cherished in various ways, and finally returned to the person who had lost it. In the process, it had created connections, fostered empathy, and reminded them both of the value of human care. The billionaire leaned back, a calm smile on his face. "Life has a way of teaching lessons in unexpected ways," he said. "Sometimes, it takes a small object or a simple moment to remind us of what really matters." The waitress nodded, understanding completely. She thought of the initial tension, the anger, and the fear she had felt. She remembered how every interaction had felt intense, how she had worried about making mistakes. And yet, all of that had led to something meaningful, a story of human connection that went beyond wealth, status, or social differences. As they talked, the other diners in the restaurant went about their meals, unaware of the quiet, meaningful exchange taking place at one table. The waitress realized that life often unfolded in such small moments, unnoticed by the world, yet significant to those involved. She felt grateful for the experience, for the chance to participate in a story larger than herself, and for the lessons she had learned along the way. The billionaire reached into his pocket and handed her a small envelope. She opened it to find a note and a tip far larger than she had ever received. The note expressed his gratitude and admiration, not just for her work as a waitress, but for the care and honesty she had shown. She felt a deep sense of pride and humility, knowing that her actions, though simple, had mattered. He smiled warmly. "You've reminded me of the importance of patience and understanding," he said, "and you've taught me that even small gestures can have a lasting impact. Thank you for that." She nodded, feeling her eyes well up slightly. "It was my pleasure, sir. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be part of this story." As he left the restaurant, she watched him go, feeling a mixture of relief and admiration. The encounter had started with tension and anger, but had evolved into something extraordinary, a lesson in empathy, trust, and human connection. She knew that she would carry this experience with her forever, a reminder that every action, no matter how small, could touch lives in ways she could not always see. That evening, as she closed the restaurant and prepared to go home, she reflected on the story of the necklace. It had traveled through different hands, creating moments of care and attention, and ultimately reuniting with the person who valued it most. In the process, it had connected two strangers in a meaningful way, reminding them both of the importance of empathy, honesty, and human understanding. The young waitress realized that life was full of unexpected lessons, moments where ordinary actions could lead to extraordinary outcomes. She thought of the billionaire, his daughter, and the journey of the necklace. Each part of the story had mattered, each interaction had significance, and every choice had led to a meaningful conclusion. As she placed the necklace back in its small box at home, she felt a sense of closure and peace. She knew that her actions had mattered, that her care and honesty had created ripples beyond her immediate world. The experience had changed her, giving her a deeper understanding of human connection and the power of small gestures. The fifth part of the story closed on a note of reflection. The young waitress had grown, the billionaire had learned something new about patience and empathy, and the necklace had completed its journey. It was a reminder that life was full of small, meaningful moments, and that human connection, care, and understanding could create stories that lasted far beyond a single encounter. The memory of that lunch, the conversation, and the shared understanding would stay with them both, a testament to the unexpected ways life could teach lessons and bring people together.